I was in the middle of a Bible study, which didn't quite turn out the way we'd expected. If you don't know what I'm talking about, I had a TIA in a meeting when I was live and present at Epsom, and Graham happily recognized what was happening and got me to the hospital. It's lovely to be with you. Really is great. And I'm going to kind of share my screen with you, and I want to tell you kind of the history of this. Andy was just saying that Galatians is my favorite book. I'm not absolutely sure whether that's true. I think probably Romans is, but I do think Galatians is one of the most useful books, because it's kind of more stripped back in a sense, and you haven't got other complications that can be distractions. And of course, it was the beginning of Paul's letter writing ministry. So in a sense, everything else kind of springs out of Galatians. And some people have described Galatians as the seed plot for Romans. You know how people do this. They begin to grow some plants from seed, and then they give them a start in the greenhouse with a cold frame or something like that. And then at some point, when they think they can take it, they move them into a fairly kind of secure seed plot and let it grow a little bit more. And people have sometimes said that Galatians is the seed plot to Romans, and there are lots and lots of connections, but I will try not to make too many connections so that we can make Galatians stand on its feet. As the people who first read it had to read it, they didn't have Romans, they couldn't cross-reference things. All they had was their past experience, excuse me, of Paul, and they had this letter that they had in front of them. And I guess they had sort of one another, because this is something which is often, I think we don't think about this very often. We just refer to Paul's writing to the Galatians. Paul isn't writing to the church of Galatia. He's writing to the churches in Galatia. Galatia was a Roman province. So this is almost in the nature of a circular letter. I don't know how many churches there were. We can identify some of them, of course, from the Acts of the Apostles and Paul's missionary journeys, as we call them. But this is in a number of churches. So I find this interesting. And this is one of the things I want to talk about a little bit. That I think as we do a Bible study, we can do it in different ways. We can follow a theme through. We can head for our favorite theme and make the whole thing revolve around that. I want to do something a little bit different. I want to talk about how we're doing the actual study and why we're doing it in this particular way, and why Bible study is really such an important part of our devotional life and of our development in the things of God. We really do have just such an enormous riches, a wealth of things that God has given to us. And I think we miss much of it simply because we haven't trained ourselves to kind of think about these things. There's an old story. I can't remember the names now, but there was a very famous naturalist, and he took on an apprentice, someone who was training, and he gave him a job to do. And the first job he gave to do was he sat him down in front of a tank of fish, and he said, I want you to spend the first day just making a note of all the things that you can see about this fish. So this new recruit began, and he did the whole thing, and he handed it in to his boss. And the next day, the boss gave him another sheet of paper and said, now I want you to spend another day kind of just looking at all the things that you notice in the fish that you didn't notice yesterday. So he was a bit kind of perplexed with this, but he got on and did it. And then on the third day, he had another blank sheet of paper. And in the end, he thought, this is ridiculous. But on about the fifth day, he got there and he thought, I'm sure I've said everything I can possibly say about these fish. I'm sick to death of these fish. And he was just looking. And then he noticed, so the story goes, he noticed a certain iridescence in the edges of the scales, and noticed how it altered from one place to another, and how it followed the contours, but also You could see it differently from different places, and he was absolutely fascinated. And he wrote several pages about the iridescence of these scales on the fish. And the naturalist said to him, "That's what I wanted you to see. I wanted you to keep on observing, 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 and all the time, if you keep doing that, you will see things that you didn't see the first time." And I think it's a good thing to do that. So I have come back to Galatians again and again and again. In fact, I'm going to base what I'm going to say tonight on something that I did when we had the church life school at Reading. We had about 3 or 4 years of that, and each year I did most of the teaching sessions for the mornings, and I always did, in the course of that kind of 6 months they were with us, I always did Galatians and another book. I always did Galatians because it is so foundational, and we could do all. So this that I'm going to do tonight actually started in the church life school, but I'm going to actually be following notes that I did when I was, I did what I called a workman workshop weekend at Aurora back in 1994. So the notes I'm following tonight are 27 years old. There are some people here, I'm not even sure whether you were here in 1994, but it's that's what I'm going to do. And I've altered them a little bit. But I've come back to this again and again and again, and we'll see how we get on. So I'm going to share my screen and see how we get on. And I'm hoping to stop maybe about 10 minutes before the end, if I can, just so that if we have any questions or maybe of things that you can foresee coming up and you want to be sure that we get to those, we'll do that. So this is going to be a really slow start, and we can find our pace together. Okay, I'm now going to share my screen. That doesn't work. That's what I want. How does that look? Can you see that?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay. So this is study 1, Galatians and the Acts. And context. If you know any of my studies that I do, this is my mantra. You know how the estate agents, they have this little mantra which says location, location, location. That's the most important thing. Keep coming back to the location. And for Bible study of the kind that we're going to do tonight, it is absolutely necessary that we come back to context. God can use his book in any way he wants to. He can take verses out of context. He can do what he wants to them. And some evangelists take the same liberties, but Bible teachers don't have the right to do that. They have the responsibility really of saying what it says and putting it into its context. And I want to show you, if I can, just how important context is in our understanding. There's an old saying that historians sometimes use, and they say, the past is a different country. They do things differently there. Have you heard that phrase? The past is a different country. They do things differently there. And I think one of the reasons we have the Bible is so that we can get into the past. Oh, I know everybody's excited about the present and looking forward to the future. But one of the things that can happen with the Bible, if we read it, study, think about it, is we can become customized to every part of the Bible. We can become accustomed to its geography, its climatology. We can become accustomed to all kinds of things. And actually, from time to time, it matters. Have you noticed how often the Bible timestamps things? How it'll say this happened, and then the next day this happened, and then 3 days later this happened. Have you noticed how often the Bible puts a place name and puts things into their context? The Bible is constantly contextualizing what it's saying, which to me is an indication that it's important. Here's a really quirky little thing here. I want to do this because I think it's important, if we can, that we become orientated to the Bible's way of looking at things. And people say, oh, well, we want to kind of be modern with it and all the rest of it. Well, you can do that when you're preaching, when you're out evangelizing. But if we want to understand this book, we need to contextualize and we need to orientate ourselves towards the Bible. For example, some years ago, some of you may have heard me say this, I was in the home of John and Josie Corcoran in Exeter, and I was staying with them, and I noticed that on their stairs they had an old print of the town of Exeter. And as I went past it, I noticed something, and I said, this is an interesting print. I mean, it wasn't an authentic one. I think it was just a print. But I said, this is an interesting image you've got here in your stairs. I said, do you know that this is properly orientated? And well, they said, what do you mean? I said, it's got east at the top. The word orient, of course, has to do with the east. And orientation meant that when you were drawing your maps, you put east at the top. Now, of course, we say orientation and we mean put north at the top. And you say, well, what's this got to do with anything? Well, it just so happens that the Bible is orientated towards the east. For example, north, south, east, west, those are our English translations. What the Bible says for north is it says in front of. And for what we say for east, they say on the right. And what we say for south, they say the sea. And for what we say to, what's the other one? The north, they say the dark or the unknown place. And you say, well, how is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because if you think about it, anyone who describes Bible maps like this, with east at the top being the front and on the right being the south, you know which way they're facing. And you say, well, why would they come up with this orientation? Because you're seeing things from God's throne in the tabernacle. God sees his land as in front of him. That's what we call east. And to the right of him, that's what we call south. And I have tried over the years to orientate myself in my mind to constantly turn my Bible maps in my pictures through 90 degrees so that I have east at the top. And at times it's significant. At times it's significant. So now you can see how pedantic we're really going to be. This is just a starter for you. Let's make a start then. Context, context, context. And let me introduce you to John Wycliffe. Hopefully, there he goes. John Wycliffe was, they sometimes call him the morning star of the Reformation. He was a man in the 14th century. I'm not going to talk too much about him, except that he translated from the Latin Vulgate into English. So the first kind of English translation that we have is really from John Wycliffe. And he was a Bible scholar, and he had people who followed him, and the group who were known as the Lollards. And he said this. Now, I've actually created this little sort of image, and this was just these are just some words, but it's me that's broken them down into 9 points. But this is from John Wycliffe. Listen to this. He says, it will greatly help you for understanding Scripture if you pay attention not only to what is spoken or written, but also of whom it was spoken or written, and to whom, with what choice of words, at what time, where, for what purpose, in what circumstances, considering also what is said before and what is said after. Maybe he didn't know my little phrase, context, 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 but that's what is just described. That's what is described. And you may know that this is really the basis of something that's called inductive Bible study. That's a particular way of studying the Bible. And as you go through it, you ask these questions. Who, what, where, when, why, how? At one time, would-be journalists were trained like this. In their journalistic schools, they were taught to ask these questions to be sure that they had the data when they started off. And that's why even to this day, you'll often get articles in the newspaper which will say 27-year-old John Smith from 5 Beswick Road and it'll just go through. And then what they're doing is they go through this little list. They're making sure that they've got all the context for the story that they've got. And I'll tell you why, for me, it is of particular interest. And that's because I am especially interested in church polity. Oops. Well, church polity really means the study of, or the understanding of, the structure and the governance of church. In other words, it has to do with how do churches relate to one another. How does the governance within the church, in its eldership and the diaconate and other functions that are in the church, how does that work? And particularly, what can we see in the New Testament where we have these things being worked out, not spelled out into this is the list of the way that you do things, but they're worked out. And if you're alert to them, you can find amazing things about the pattern of life that was existing in those days. And that's why right at the beginning, I said, this is the letter to the churches in Galatia. And notice, although Galatia is a Roman province, and in our modern language, people would often say, well, the church in Galatia. No, it isn't the church in Galatia. It's the churches in Galatia. There isn't one church in Galatia. There's this confederation, this connection of one thing to another, and then giving it the label, the church in Galatia, or the church in Judea, or the church in Africa, or the church in the 21st century, or the young people's church, or this church, or that church. That concept has no presence in the Bible. The only wholeness picture for the church is of the Church of Jesus Christ, the one family in heaven and earth. And every church in the Bible is effectively a house church. Every single one of them is independent. It has links, not organizational links, certainly not hierarchical links, with apostles and with itinerant ministries and with other churches. But each one has its own unique identity and operates in its own unique way. But it doesn't mean we can't learn from them. It says this in the book of the Revelation, doesn't it? He that has ears to hear, let him hear what the Spirit is saying to the churches. But God said something different to the church at Ephesus to what he said to the church at Smyrna, and all the way through. Because every church is at a different stage. Every church needs a unique word from God. And Jesus, unlike the Old Testament, where there was one lampstand with one base in the land of Israel, the churches of the New Testament are illustrated in 7 separate lampstands. In the Old Covenant, if you remove the lampstand, the light had gone. Ephesus is threatened with having its lampstand removed. If it does remove, there are still 6 lights to bear the testimony. There are really important pictures that are behind this, and you may know that this is a bit of a hobby horse with me, but I think it's important. Not because I'm looking for a perfect blueprint. I'm not looking for a blueprint. There was a time when I would have looked for one, but I'm not. I'm looking to see what the Spirit of God has recorded about the way in which his presence and power through the churches was facilitated by the ways in which the church had their polity, the way they understood one another. And I'm interested to trace it into the first century and the 2nd century too, up to about 200 AD, because you'll find that there is no concept of a universal earthly church until you get a man named Ignatius of Antioch. But we're not going down that thing just at the present time. Let's just ask these, or make this point.
Ron, sorry, could you zoom in slightly on your document?
It's me you want to zoom in, is it? There's the document.
Yeah.
Can I do that? Just a minute. No, I think no, that was that.
That's it.
Yeah. That's great.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Ron.
All right, is that okay? About right? Okay. Okay. So church polity and structure. We need to know as much as we can about the occasion of a letter. All the letters in the Bible are what they call occasional. That doesn't mean every now and again. It means there was an occasion that triggered the letter. And if we can discover the occasion which triggered the letter, it really will help us in our interpretation of it. Secondly, we need to know the writer and the readers of the epistle. And I'm choosing to use the word epistle, again, a bit pedantically, because there is a difference between an epistle and a letter. An epistle is a particular genre of letter. It's a particular kind of letter. It's a little bit like a public letter to the Times. It isn't like the chatty little letter that you might get sent to Philemon, although even Philemon, I think, is aware that there's going to be a public audience to this and not just the one person who receives it. So these epistles have a certain structure that was known in the day. And to understand that, you know that they begin with a pattern. It's usually the first thing is the person who wrote the letter, and then there's an address to the person who is receiving the letter, and then some word of commendation, and then after that it begins to kind of flow into the purpose of the letter. We need to know the writer and his readers. I think this is key. There are some people who think Paul is harsh. There are some people who think he treated Peter very badly in dealing with him publicly. I think these people do not know Paul. They've not met Paul in his letters. They've not put Paul into the context of his life. Some people say, well, he should not have dealt with Peter the way he was. That was rude. It was abrasive. It was arrogant. It was not the way to do it. Remember, in the letter to the Galatians, we have this thing that Paul says, if any man is overtaken in a fault, let those who are spiritual correct, mend one another, considering themselves, lest they also are tempted. The man who wrote that also wrote Galatians chapter 2, where he details his story with Peter. So don't put a harsh sound into Paul's mouth. It says in Corinthians that there's no voice that is without significance. Our Bibles usually say it's the Greek word power, dunamis. The way we say things has power. You can say something like, what shall we say? Here's the question. Here's a good example from Ephesians. Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Can you hear the sound in the voice? How about this one? Oh, foolish Galatians, who has bewitched you? Can you hear the sound in the voice? I want you to get to know Paul. I want you to get to know the man. You can't understand this letter unless you understand the man and the people that he is speaking to, of whom he says he is willing to go through the birth pangs again and again and again and again until Christ is formed in you. That's the heart of the man. Interpret his letter by what we see of the man's character. So we need to know the nature of the relationship between the writer and his readers. We need to know the context in which the relationship operated. And these are essential to our particular method of interpretation. Okay, now we're going to go on now to the study itself. This is me. I've split those things up, and we're not going to do all of them. You'll be glad to know tonight. Where's my watch? Okay. Let's have a look at this one first. Of whom it was spoken. Let's just, we are the sum total of our experiences in life and our reactions to them. That's the thing that forms our character. So if we want to understand Paul, we need to kind of look at his life. He doesn't just kind of spring into existence in Galatians chapter 1. And in fact, in Galatians chapter 1, it begins here. Can you see that all right? Okay. Paul, an apostle. Just imagine if you didn't have the Acts of the Apostles and you found this letter. When you think, well, it looks important. Who's Paul? What's an apostle? Who are all these brethren who are with him? If you move on to verse 2, what's a church? And why are the churches in Galatia? You see, it's impossible to understand the letters to the letter to the churches in Galatia if we don't integrate it into the Acts of the Apostles. We need to know the man. We need to know the people he's talking to. Now, this takes time. Occasionally, people will say to me, "How long did it take you to prepare that one?" Well, I'll tell you, at least 27 years for this one tonight. At least 27 years. There's a little bit more as Paul writes to the Romans, of course, who he didn't know in the way that he knew the Galatians. Can you see this all right?
It's fine. Yeah.
It's okay. Okay. It's just that on my copy, I'm getting some of your pictures down the right-hand side. I can alter that, can't I? Second. One of my options.
You can minimize the pictures of the little thing on the left.
Okay, I can do it now. I'm all right, I think. Okay. So that's Galatians. But let's look at Romans chapter 1. I say he's writing to many people at Rome who he doesn't know and who don't know him. And listen how he introduces himself. Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ, called to be an apostle, separated to the gospel of God. These two ideas, a bondservant and an apostle. An apostle, that's really an emissary. It's someone who was sent with a message from the king or with the central government or something like that. It's a man with authority. He has the right to say something because he's been given a message. He's been given the kerugma, which is the preaching. It is the declaration. This man has been given to it, but this man, first of all, regards himself as a bondservant of Jesus Christ. And if you put together the ideas of a bondservant who has no rights at all, absolutely none, and an apostle who has an authority, a commission from the Lord of Lords, you begin to understand in Paul why you come across amazing tenderness and things that are expressed with tremendous authority and power. And we must not only interpret Paul the man from what we see in the scriptures, and I'll tell you why. Because when Paul wrote second time round to the Corinthians, he made reference to some of the criticisms that were being made to him about him. And he says, this is what you're saying, this is what some of you are saying. You're saying, well, his letters are weighty, but his bodily presence is nothing special. And his speech is contemptible. So you mustn't think of Paul as a kind of a dynamic preacher necessarily, because you are encountering Paul through his God-given task as a writer of these Gospels. And there is an authority coming through that doesn't necessarily mean he carries that same kind of authority with every other part of his life. It isn't that an apostle is kind of somewhere at the top of a tier or something. An apostle has a job to do, and when he does it, he does it with conviction, with authority, because that's the job that God has given him to do. But Paul was very conscious that there was a limit. His line, as he calls it in the Old King James Version, he had a limit, and he didn't want to go beyond his limit. And when we kind of come to things like this, we need to consider it and realize that we are encountering Paul in kind of in full power, and you come across things in Paul that take you by surprise. If you're only encountering Paul through his letters and you're not thinking about it, you'll be amazed when Paul writes to the Corinthians. He says, "When I came to you, I was with you in fear and trembling." You say, "Who? Paul?" Surely not Paul. Well, you see, we're used to encountering him through his letters. And there's no fear and trembling in the letters. But in Paul's day-to-day life, he was just a man like you and I. And there will be times when he was perplexed. That's one of the things he says about himself. He was perplexed. Times when he didn't quite understand what the implications were of what he was going through. I want to make this man human for us, brothers and sisters. And that's what I really want to do. And I want to see just how important this is. So let's go on. So I've said this. Imagine we didn't have the Acts of the Apostles. Oops, sorry. The Gospels end with Christ ascending, passing beyond human sight. I don't know what that word means. Who is Paul? Why does he call himself an apostle? What's a church? Why are some churches in Galatia? It would be almost impossible to make sense of the epistles without the Acts. And these are some of the things I said earlier. Now, who is Paul? Well, he was a Roman citizen. And you can find that. I've got a little PDF that I'll send to you with all these references in. But on a couple of occasions, at least, Paul refers to himself as a Roman citizen, and he makes the point that he was born a Roman citizen. Now, Roman citizenship had the top of the pile in Rome was a man called the paterfamilias, and he had absolute authority over his family, his wife or wives, his children's wives. Technically, he had the power of life and death, and they had full authority. A Roman citizen had all the full authority of the power of Rome behind him. That's why a Roman citizen could not be flogged without a trial. And it's why a Roman citizen could never be crucified. It's an interesting thing that comes out of the traditions. I don't know whether they're true, but it's interesting that Peter, they say, was crucified upside down. Peter would be treated as a non-person, a non-citizen. He had no rights, as Jesus was treated with no rights, a non-person. Paul, they say, was beheaded. That would have been his prerogative as a Roman citizen. Only non-persons, slaves, criminals, murderers were crucified. Okay. So he had Roman citizenship, and you know that on a couple of occasions he used his Roman citizenship. He was born a citizen, so his father or his grandfather must have become a Roman citizen. And then you've got the big question mark, well, how did his father or his grandfather become a Roman citizen? We don't know is the answer to it. We don't know. He may have purchased it at a great price. The Roman centurion said that's how he had become a Roman citizen. Or he may have performed some notable service to where Paul was, because he was raised in Tarsus, and he may have performed some citizen job that was highly regarded, and so he was given that reward. So Paul was a citizen, and he was born a citizen in Tarsus, in Cilicia. That's in modern-day Turkey. And there are references to that. And the town had an important reputation for scholarship, and occasionally you'll hear people say Paul was educated at the University of Tarsus. That is sheer speculation. And the first commandment of a Bible teacher is, "Thou shalt not speculate." I'm going to speculate in a minute or two, just to show you that I'm not an absolute pedant. Yes, it was an important place for reputation. And some people think that Paul was educated there, but he may have left as a child. His early life, he was a Jew born in Tarsus, in Cilicia. Sorry, I can't control my thing here. He was brought up, but Paul says when he was in Jerusalem, he says that he was brought up in this city. Now, does that mean his mother took him there? Or it depends where you put the comma. Was he brought up in this city, comma, and then the next point, under Gamaliel? Or is it saying that he was brought up under Gamaliel? And there are two ways of looking at it. It might mean his mother raised him in Jerusalem, but he was brought up in this city also. at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law. Gamaliel was one of the main rabbis. He was one of the most famous Jewish rabbis. He was known as a Rabban, our teacher, which is a higher title than rabbi. And he was a greatly honored teacher from the liberal, that's the gentler wing of the Pharisee sect. And you say, well, how did Paul come from that then, if Hillel was the more gentle thing? And we've got some examples in the scripture, haven't we, of one in particular, of Gamaliel's way of looking at things. Paul was a very Orthodox Jew. He was a Benjamite, like Israel's first king. He was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. Now, this is important because this tells you about Paul's mindset. There were thousands, millions of people who had moved out of Israel, the land, and were scattered around the borders of the Mediterranean Sea in particular. And they began to acquire a Greek mindset. They lost their Hebrew language. And about 200 BC, they actually created a translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, in Koine Greek, which really becomes almost kind of the King James version of the early Christians. But Paul was a Hebrew of the Hebrews. He thought like the Hebrews. His mother tongue was Hebrew. His instincts were Hebrew. Not all Pharisees were like that. No, sorry, not all Jews were like that. Others were Hellenists. Now, the Hellenists had a Greek mindset, and there was always a tension between the two. And it is really interesting, and you may have some insight as to why this might be the case. But it almost seems as though Jesus avoided the Hellenist cities. He didn't visit, for example, the cities down the Mediterranean coast. There are other places, although we do know that he went into the Decapolis, which is just the other side of the Jordan River, which is also kind of Hellenist territory. Okay, not all the Pharisees were hypocritical. Paul says he lived according to the strictest sect of his religion. He lived as a Pharisee. And in Acts chapter 26 and verse 10, he refers to a time, and he says, when people were being harassed and persecuted, he gave his vote against them. Now, that can mean a pebble. It might actually mean he actually threw stones, but it might also mean that he used a black pebble in the voting of a Sanhedrin. If Paul was a member of the Sanhedrin, he must have been at least 30. And now we get into territory that we can't pursue because we don't know the answers to it. He must also have had a wife at one point to have been a member of the Sanhedrin. And here's a question for you. Did he ever meet Christ? Now, this is where I get into speculation. There's an occasion in the Bible where a rich young ruler comes running to Jesus, and he falls at Jesus's feet, and he has a question, and he says, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus speaks to him. You know this passage. I'm not going to go into it. But he says, well, I've done all these things from my youth. And then Jesus puts his finger on covetousness. And he says, sell everything you've got, give it to the poor, take up your cross, come and follow me. And it says that the young man was rich because he had much goods. And he went away sorrowing. And it says that Jesus sorrowed when he saw him going away. It's a story of two men sorrowing as they separate at this point in time. We don't know who this man was, this man who was the ruler of the synagogue, a wealthy man. But Paul must have been someone very, very similar to this man. He was a straight arrow. He was an ardent Pharisee. He was someone who wanted to do the right thing. But it was the covetousness, which was the thing that finally nailed him and made him realize that he could never be what God intended him to be. Perhaps. There are some references for you. Okay. Let's go on to this part of his life. In Acts chapter 8 and verse 1, it says that Paul was consenting to the death of Stephen. And I wonder whether, maybe still under the gentler influences of someone like Gamaliel, maybe Paul wasn't always such an extremist. His Phariseeism may have pointed in that direction. But I wonder, what was it that changed this man into maybe someone who didn't like what was happening, but was just minding his own business, to someone who became an absolute zealot, a man who became a fanatic in determining to destroy this sect of the Nazarene? I think the answer is the stoning of Stephen. He saw not just the spread, but he saw the nature of what was happening. He saw and heard what we call Stephen's defense. And he saw that, in a sense, there was no compromise between the sect of the Nazarenes and any of the other sects within Judaism. No compromise between that and the Pharisees, or with the Sadducees, or with the Essenes, none of them. This was an either-or thing. And he saw the power of this man. And he saw him when he looked up into heaven, and his face was like the face of an angel. And he saw him praying for the people who were actually stoning him to death. And now he could go one of two ways. And Paul determined that this was life or death for Judaism. And he would nail his colors to the mast, and he would destroy this infant thing called the Church of the Nazarene. And we know how that worked out. Uses some very strong words about Paul. He made havoc. He rampaged and outraged. It talks about slaughter. The word for persecute is actually harassing and pursuing. Wasted means raising something to the ground. In fact, Paul was the first century equivalent of the leader of Chairman Mao's Red Guards. He was a nightmare for the early church. He was a one-man Holocaust for these early Christians. Fanatical, ruthless, relentless, and utterly convinced that he was right. Winston Churchill had a definition for a fanatic. He said a fanatic is someone who can't change his mind and won't change the subject. And according to that definition, Paul was a fanatic. This is the last bit of Acts chapter 7 and on into Acts chapter 8. It'll come a little bit later. They cast him out of the city and stoned him. And the witnesses laid their clothes at the feet of a young man named Saul. And they stoned Stephen as he was calling on God and saying, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. These are kind of amazing things. And then, of course, he became a disciple. But I'm going to leave that until the next time. This is Paul's journey. This is where he came from. This is a man who was equipped with amazing powers of intellect and understanding. A man who had a tremendous work ethic, an energetic constitution. A man who could have gone both ways, and he did go both ways. He went, first of all, with all the venom that he could muster against the early Christians. And then something happened to this man, which gave him his gospel. And when Paul writes his gospel to the saints at Rome, and he begins to explain it, and he says the gospel is the power of God. He knew it. It's the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, but also to the Greek. This man was no longer the man he was born. This is why this man says things like, if any man be in Christ, he becomes a new creation. Old things have passed away. Behold, all things are new, become new. It wasn't just that the gospel is intellectually satisfying or rational once you have accepted its basic foundations. It's not that. The power of God had touched this man, and it changed him. It turned him around from someone who was prepared to go to any length in order to destroy the Christian church to a man who was prepared to go to any lengths in order to serve it and to love it. And the man who I think is just an extraordinary example of a man who became a free apostle of the Holy Spirit, a man taught of God, a man that I don't know whether we shall have a lot of time to talk to one another, but I shall want to go to Paul and say thank you. Thank you. Paul, in his little testimony in Philippians, he says two things. He says he counted the loss of all things for the sake of knowing Christ. And then a verse, maybe two verses later, he says, for whom I have experienced the lot of all things. The loss of all things. So Paul then apparently had a time when he was wealthy. Did he lose everything with this? I met a Hindu, a Brahmin once, who when he became a Christian, he lost everything. He lost his wife, and the family took away the children. His inheritance was cancelled. He's thrown out of the family, absolutely everything he lost. Paul isn't just reckoning the loss of all things. In his testimony, Paul says, for whom I've suffered the loss of all things. This man was a great gift to the church and still is. And I'm going to stop now and see if you've got, those of you who are awake, if you've got any, where are you? Oh, yeah, can't find you. Are you there? Are you? There you are. Can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Can you see anything else? Oh, I need to stop sharing, don't I? There we go. We'll get used to this one day. Okay, so I know I was given liberty, so I don't have to finish at 9. But if you